The classroom was filled with the soft murmur of students flipping through notebooks, scratching pencils against paper, and whispering about the upcoming assignment. It was an ordinary morning at the university, and the sunlight streamed through tall windows, spilling across rows of desks. In the very back corner of the lecture hall sat a young woman, quiet and unnoticed, her gaze focused on the open textbook in front of her. She had a calm presence that blended into the background, so much so that most people hardly remembered she was there at all. She never spoke unless asked, never volunteered answers, and never drew attention to herself. Yet beneath that quiet exterior was a mind sharper than anyone around her could imagine. Since childhood, she had always found comfort in numbers. While other children played outside, she had spent hours with puzzles, shapes, and equations that fascinated her more than dolls or toys. She had been the kind of student who would finish a math test before the teacher had even finished handing out all the papers. To her, numbers were like music, they flowed in patterns, they had rhythm, and they never betrayed her. They gave her a sense of stability and beauty that words sometimes failed to give. But life had also taught her that being too loud about her intelligence could attract unwanted attention. So she chose to remain quiet, letting her brilliance shine only in private moments when no one was watching. Her classmates, however, rarely thought of her as anything special. To them, she was just the quiet girl who sat in the back, scribbled notes, and left the room without saying much. Even when exams were returned, she didn't boast or celebrate her grades. She simply folded the paper neatly and slipped it into her folder. Some thought she was shy, some thought she was uninterested, and a few even assumed she was struggling. But in truth, she was often several steps ahead of both her classmates and sometimes even the professor. The calculus professor who taught the class was a man who loved the sound of his own voice. His presence filled the room as much as his lectures did. He walked into class with his head held high, carrying an air of superiority, and often spoke with a tone that made students feel small. He was known for his sharp remarks, his sarcastic humor, and his tendency to humiliate students who gave wrong answers. To him, silence was weakness, and mistakes were opportunities to remind everyone of his authority. Many students feared him, and no one dared to challenge his position. He noticed the quiet woman early in the semester. To him, her silence was not a sign of intelligence but of laziness. He believed that if she truly understood the subject, she would participate, speak up, and show her work proudly. In his eyes, she was just another weak student hiding in the back row. He never once imagined that she might have reasons of her own for staying quiet. Instead, he formed an opinion of her, and that opinion grew stronger each day as he saw her sitting silently, her eyes never leaving the pages of her notebook. One morning, as the professor launched into another lecture filled with complex formulas and long explanations, his eyes drifted toward the back of the room. There she was again, sitting perfectly still, her pencil moving steadily across the page. He felt a surge of irritation. He wanted participation, not passivity. He wanted students who challenged him, who spoke out and proved their worth. And here was this woman, hidden in plain sight, as if the world around her didn't matter. He convinced himself that she must not understand the material. Why else would she never raise her hand? The woman, however, wasn't ignoring him. She was deeply focused, her mind absorbing every word, every symbol, and every equation. She wasn't the type to interrupt or seek attention. Instead, she processed information silently, carefully, storing it in her mind like precious treasure. She knew that knowledge didn't require an audience. Still, she could feel the professor's gaze on her from time to time. She noticed the way he seemed to look down at her, the way he skipped over her when asking questions, as if expecting nothing from her. It didn't hurt her feelings. She had grown used to being underestimated. What people didn't know about her didn't bother her. But she also knew that one day, when the right moment came, her abilities would speak louder than any words she could say. Outside of class, Her life was much the same. She lived simply, dedicating much of her free time to studying mathematics at levels far beyond her coursework. She had old books filled with advanced problems, books most students would struggle to even understand. But for her, these were treasures. She loved the challenge, the complexity, the way numbers could twist into something almost magical when solved. She could lose herself for hours in pages of equations, her mind finding peace in the certainty that math always offered an answer, even if the path to it was long. Her classmates would never guess that the quiet girl who slipped out of class unnoticed was, in truth, solving problems even graduate students would find intimidating. The professor's irritation with her silence, however, grew little by little. In his mind, he was the authority in the room, the one who should always hold the attention and respect of his students. And though she was respectful, her calm stillness made him feel as though she wasn't fully engaged. He mistook her silence for defiance. On some days, he even wondered if she was mocking him by not reacting at all to his teaching. His pride made it impossible for him to see that the woman was, in fact, listening more closely than anyone else. Meanwhile, other students began noticing how she never seemed to struggle. While many of them scribbled furiously during lectures, trying to keep up, she wrote with a kind of grace and patience, as if she already knew where the lecture was going. She never seemed rushed, never seemed lost, and her notes were so clean and organized that they almost looked like a polished textbook. A few students even whispered to each other, wondering if she was smarter than she let on. But since she never revealed anything, they quickly forgot their curiosity and went back to their own worries. That semester moved steadily, with the professor's arrogance and the students' quiet determination existing side by side. He remained blind to her abilities, convinced that her silence was a weakness. She, on the other hand, continued her quiet path, letting the world underestimate her while she built her strength in silence. Neither of them knew that soon, a moment would come that would change everything: the professor's opinion, the classmates' perception, and even the way she saw herself. For now, though, she remained in the back row, quietly brilliant, patiently waiting for the right moment to shine. The lecture hall was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that seemed to hold an invisible weight. The professor stood at the front of the room, chalk in hand, scanning the faces of his students. He had already explained a difficult concept, one that made many of them shift nervously in their seats. Some tried to follow along, scribbling incomplete notes, while others simply stared blankly, already lost in the maze of symbols on the board. The professor liked moments like these. He enjoyed reminding his students of the distance between their knowledge and his own. It fed his pride and made him feel untouchable. As his eyes drifted to the back of the room, he noticed her again. The quiet woman sat there, her expression calm, as if she were unaffected by the difficulty of the lesson. She wasn't panicking like the others, nor did she look overwhelmed. She simply wrote with her steady hand, her pencil moving across the page with a focus that almost annoyed him. To him, this calmness seemed like arrogance. He assumed she wasn't trying, that she was pretending to understand, and something inside him decided that today would be the day he exposed her weakness. He cleared his throat and turned to the class. "Since everyone looks a little confused," he said with a half smile, "let's see if someone can solve this problem." With quick strokes, he wrote a large equation on the board. It was long, complicated, and far more difficult than anything he had officially assigned. Whispers ran through the classroom as students exchanged nervous glances. Most of them avoided his eyes, afraid he might choose them. The professor, however, wasn't interested in the usual students he called upon. Instead, his gaze settled on the quiet woman in the back. He pointed the chalk toward her and said, "You. Why don't you come up here and show us how much you've been learning?" The room fell silent. A ripple of surprise spread through the class. Many students turned to look at her, their eyes filled with curiosity. Some felt pity, certain that she was about to be humiliated. Others leaned forward, eager to watch what they thought would be an embarrassing scene. After all, she had never spoken in class, never offered answers, never given anyone a reason to think she could handle something like this. She looked up slowly, meeting the professor's eyes. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, without complaint, she closed her notebook, stood, and walked quietly to the front. There was no trace of fear in her movements. She didn't rush, she didn't hesitate, and though she could feel every pair of eyes on her, she appeared calm, almost serene, as if this moment was nothing unusual. The professor handed her the chalk with a smirk. He fully expected her to struggle. In his mind, this was his chance to prove that silence was nothing more than ignorance. The woman, however, held the chalk lightly in her hand, turned toward the board, and studied the problem. The students waited, their anticipation building. Some whispered that she might faint. Others whispered that maybe she would just stand there until the professor told her to sit down. But instead of freezing, she lifted the chalk and began writing. At first, the room stayed quiet, the sound of chalk scratching against the board filling the air. She wrote slowly, carefully, each step deliberate, her handwriting neat and clear. Her process was not rushed or messy, it was precise, almost elegant. The students leaned forward, realizing that she wasn't just writing random things, she was solving the problem, and she was doing it with a confidence none of them expected. The professor's smile faded slightly. He folded his arms, watching her more closely now. He told himself that she had probably memorized the first steps of the formula, that she would surely falter as the problem became more difficult. But she didn't. Line after line, she worked through it, never pausing to second-guess herself. Her movements were steady, her eyes sharp with concentration. It was as if she had been waiting for this problem, as if she had already solved it 100 times in her mind before. Whispers turned into gasps as students realized what was happening. She wasn't fumbling. She wasn't hesitating. She was solving a problem that many of them couldn't even begin to approach, and she was doing it with ease. Some of them glanced at each other, eyebrows raised, as if silently asking, "Who is she?" The quiet girl they had overlooked for weeks was suddenly commanding their full attention. When she reached the final step, she set down the chalk with calm certainty and stepped aside. On the board, the complete solution stood, every line perfectly written, the answer correct. A hush fell over the room. For a long moment, no one spoke. The professor stared at the board, his lips pressed tightly together, his smirk gone. He had expected humiliation, but instead, he found himself surprised, even unsettled. The students, however, couldn't hold back their amazement. A few clapped softly before catching themselves, unsure if applause was allowed. Others whispered excitedly, unable to hide their shock. The woman simply returned the chalk, gave a polite nod, and walked back to her seat as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She opened her notebook again, flipped to a fresh page, and resumed her writing, ignoring the stares of her classmates. The professor cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the moment. He said something about the importance of practice, pretending that this had been a teaching exercise all along. But his voice lacked the same sharpness it usually carried. He had expected to show his superiority, but instead, he had been confronted with brilliance he hadn't anticipated. Yet pride is a stubborn thing. He told himself that it must have been luck, that perhaps she had seen a similar problem before, or that she had memorized a method without truly understanding it. He couldn't allow himself to accept that she had solved it so naturally because of genuine talent. His pride wouldn't let him. And so, in the back of his mind, he decided he would challenge her again, with something even harder. Meanwhile, the students were buzzing with quiet excitement. During the break, whispers spread like wildfire across the classroom. Some admitted they had underestimated her. Others speculated about how she had learned to solve such a difficult problem. A few even looked at her with newfound respect, considering whether to ask her for help with their own work. She, however, paid no attention to the whispers. She didn't crave recognition, and she didn't need praise. She solved the problem not to prove anything to her professor or classmates but because it was natural for her. Numbers, equations, and logic were a part of who she was. Solving them gave her peace, not pride. Still, she couldn't ignore the shift in the air. She could feel the professor watching her more carefully now, his expression harder to read. She could sense her classmates glancing at her, their curiosity sharper than ever. She had stepped out of her invisibility without meaning to, and though she remained calm on the outside, inside she wondered what the consequences might be. What she didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The professor, unsettled by her quiet strength, was already planning another test, one even more difficult, designed to truly push her limits. He still believed that he could catch her off guard, that he could expose her as ordinary. But he had no idea that his challenge would only reveal more of her hidden genius, shocking him and the entire class again in ways they never expected. The following week, the atmosphere in the lecture hall felt different. It was as if an invisible tension hung in the air every time the quiet woman entered the room. Her classmates now watched her with curiosity, whispering among themselves when she took her usual seat at the back. Some looked at her with admiration, others with disbelief, and a few even with envy. Just days earlier, she had been almost invisible, but now she was at the center of everyone's attention. The memory of how she had solved the professor's difficult problem so effortlessly was still fresh in their minds. For her, though, nothing had changed. She still carried her notebook, still sat in her favorite spot near the window, and still kept to herself. She didn't dress differently, she didn't walk with pride, and she didn't even acknowledge the stares she received. She acted as if the event that had shaken the entire class was nothing more than an ordinary moment. In her mind, it truly was. Solving problems came naturally to her, and she hadn't stepped to the board to prove herself. She had done it because she had been asked, and she had treated it like any other problem she solved at home. The professor, however, hadn't forgotten either, but his reaction was not admiration. It was discomfort. He replayed the moment in his mind, trying to convince himself that it had been luck. He told himself that she had probably memorized the steps of that particular kind of problem, and that she couldn't possibly handle something truly advanced. His pride wouldn't let him accept the truth that one of his students might actually surpass him in skill or understanding. And so, beneath his calm expression, he began planning how he could challenge her again, this time in a way that would leave no doubt about her limits. The opportunity came sooner than expected. During another lecture, after finishing his explanation, he turned to the board and carefully wrote out a problem that was far more advanced than anything they had ever practiced in class. It wasn't just complicated, it required creativity and deep understanding, the kind of problem that could make even experienced mathematicians pause. He turned to the students with a look that carried both challenge and expectation. "Who would like to try this?" he asked, his tone sharp, though his eyes were already focused on the back of the room. No one volunteered. Most of the students lowered their heads, pretending to flip through their notes, praying they wouldn't be chosen. Finally, as the silence stretched on, he called out her name. The class grew restless. Once again, all eyes turned toward the quiet woman. She looked up, her calm expression unchanged, and rose from her seat. As she walked to the front, whispers filled the room. Some students whispered encouragement, others muttered doubts, but everyone was eager to see what would happen. The professor stepped aside, watching her closely, his arms folded as though waiting for her to fail. She studied the problem carefully. Her eyes scanned the long equation, her mind breaking it down into parts. For a brief moment, the room was so silent that the ticking of a clock could be heard. Then she began to write. Her steps were not rushed, her chalk moved slowly and steadily, as though each stroke was placed with purpose. She wasn't just solving the problem, she was explaining it through the way she wrote, each step flowing naturally into the next. At first, the professor told himself she would get stuck halfway. But as the minutes passed, his confidence began to slip. She was not only moving through the problem, but she was doing it with remarkable clarity. Her method wasn't the common approach he expected. Instead, she was using techniques that showed a deeper understanding, strategies that came from her own way of seeing patterns others might miss. The students leaned forward, completely absorbed. It was as if they were watching a story unfold on the board, each line leading to the next with surprising elegance. Some even began taking notes on her steps, realizing they were learning more from her demonstration than from the professor's lectures. The quiet woman who had once blended into the background was now teaching the entire room without speaking a word. When she finally reached the last step, she placed the chalk down gently, her answer standing complete on the board. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a wave of murmurs, gasps, and even a few claps that quickly faded as students looked around nervously, unsure if they should cheer. The professor's face was unreadable. Inside, however, he felt a mixture of frustration and unease. He had expected to prove her unprepared, but instead, she had once again exceeded his expectations. He forced a stiff nod and muttered something about good effort before moving on with the lecture, but the class wasn't fooled. They had seen what had happened. She had not only solved the professor's challenge but had done it with skill that surpassed what they thought possible. After class, groups of students gathered in the hallway, buzzing with excitement. For the first time, some approached her directly. A few asked how she had learned those methods, while others shyly asked if she could help them understand their homework. She listened politely, answering with kindness but never boasting. She explained things clearly, her voice soft yet confident, and the students quickly realized that she had a gift not only for solving problems but also for teaching them. Yet even with this sudden attention, she remained unchanged. She didn't seek popularity, nor did she let pride overtake her. When she returned home, she continued her usual routine, sitting at her desk, surrounded by books filled with advanced calculus problems, working through them for hours simply because she loved it. Numbers were her world, and no amount of attention at school could distract her from that quiet joy. The professor, however, could not let it go. His pride burned at the thought of being overshadowed in his own classroom. He had built a reputation as a strict, intelligent teacher who could not be challenged, and now one of his own students had done exactly that. He felt threatened, though he would never admit it. To him, it was no longer about teaching, it was about proving that he still held the highest place in the room. The students began to notice the change. Whenever she walked into class, they felt the tension between her and the professor. He no longer called on other students as often. Instead, his eyes always seemed to seek her out, as though every lecture had become a silent battle between the two. Some students even joked quietly that the class had turned into a contest of wills, with the professor trying to test her limits and the quiet woman answering each challenge with calm brilliance. But she never treated it as a contest. To her, solving problems was never about defeating anyone. It was about the love she had for learning, the satisfaction of finding order in complexity. While the professor grew restless and competitive, she remained steady, never losing sight of why she loved mathematics in the first place. As the semester moved forward, the quiet woman's reputation continued to grow. Her classmates respected her, some even admired her, and more students sought her help. The professor's pride, on the other hand, only deepened his determination. He was convinced that somewhere, somehow, he would find a problem she couldn't solve. But he had no idea that his search for her weakness would only lead him to discover her greatest strength. The tension in the classroom had grown heavier with each passing week. What once had been an ordinary lecture hall now felt like an arena where a silent contest was unfolding. The professor, once confident and untouchable, had become restless. His sharp remarks were no longer aimed at the entire class but seemed to circle around one person, the quiet woman in the back row. He couldn't ignore the fact that she had succeeded every time he tried to test her. His pride, wounded but still burning, convinced him that she must eventually fail. He only had to push harder, set the challenge higher, and expose the limits of her ability. The woman, however, carried herself no differently. She came to class as she always had, notebook in hand, sitting near the window where sunlight spilled onto her desk. She didn't acknowledge the tension, nor did she let the professor's behavior disturb her. She simply listened, wrote her notes, and absorbed each lesson with quiet concentration. To her, the professor's challenges were not battles but opportunities to engage with the subject she loved most. She had never thought of it as a competition, but the atmosphere in the room told another story. One morning, the professor arrived with a stack of notes under his arm, his expression more determined than usual. He began the lecture in his usual way, but his eyes flicked often to the back, as if waiting for the right moment. When the board was cleared, he turned to the class and announced that today they would attempt something beyond the syllabus. His tone carried a weight that made the students uneasy. They had seen this before, his way of setting traps for the quiet woman. With steady hands, he filled the board with a monstrous equation, longer and more tangled than anything they had seen before. The symbols seemed to crawl across the black surface, complex and intimidating. Murmurs spread through the room as students exchanged nervous glances. It was the kind of problem that most of them couldn't even begin to approach. When the professor finished writing, he stepped back and turned slowly toward the class. "Now," he said, his voice calm but sharp, "let's see if anyone has the courage to solve this." No hands were raised. Students shifted in their seats, pretending to study their notes, hoping his eyes would pass over them. But everyone knew who he was really looking at. His gaze found its way to the back of the room, and without hesitation, he called on her. The moment her name was spoken, the classroom fell silent. Heads turned, eyes wide, whispers stopped. Once again, all attention was on the quiet woman. She rose gently, her notebook closing with a soft sound, and walked to the front. She didn't rush, she didn't falter. Her calmness was almost unsettling, as though she were walking into familiar territory rather than a trap. The professor handed her the chalk, his expression unreadable, though his eyes glimmered with a mixture of challenge and expectation. The problem on the board loomed before her like a mountain. For a few seconds, she stood still, studying the tangled symbols. Her classmates held their breath, certain that this time the task was too great. Then she began. Her hand moved slowly, drawing neat lines of reasoning onto the board. Each stroke of chalk seemed purposeful, as though she were not only solving the problem but also unraveling a story hidden within it. The class leaned forward, captivated by her focus. She didn't rush or stumble, she worked with patience, breaking down the impossible into simple, clear steps. At first, the professor stood confidently, arms crossed, convinced she would hit a wall. But as the minutes passed, his confidence began to waver. She moved past the parts he thought would trap her. She sidestepped the errors he assumed she would make. She solved smaller puzzles within the larger equation with precision that left no room for doubt. The room was silent except for the soft scratching of chalk against the board. Students who normally lost focus during lectures were now glued to every movement of her hand. Some scribbled notes furiously, trying to follow her process. Others simply stared, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. The professor's smirk had long vanished. His brow furrowed as he tried to keep up with her logic. He recognized that she wasn't simply applying memorized methods, she was thinking through the problem in real time, inventing pathways that even he hadn't considered. Her work was clean, elegant, and creative. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the final step. Her chalk stopped, and she placed it back on the ledge beneath the board. The complete solution stood before the class, clear and correct. She turned, nodded politely, and walked back to her seat without a trace of triumph. To her, it was simply another problem solved. The silence that followed was heavy. Then came a wave of hushed voices, gasps, and even a few claps before students caught themselves, afraid of the professor's reaction. He cleared his throat, his face stiff, and muttered something vague about unexpected methods before hastily moving on to the next part of his lecture. But the class wasn't fooled. They had seen his defeat written across his face. Afterward, the students couldn't stop talking. In the hallway, in the cafeteria, even in study groups, her name was whispered with respect. Some described her as a genius, others as a mystery, and a few admitted they had never seen anyone outshine a professor in such a way. Her quiet nature only added to the fascination. She didn't boast, she didn't explain herself, and she didn't seek attention. She simply carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. But inside the professor, the storm grew stronger. His pride was not only wounded, it was shaken. He had built his identity on being the authority, the one who could never be challenged. Yet here was a student who, with calm silence, had undone his image in front of the very class he sought to impress. Each time she succeeded, it wasn't just a solution on the board, it was a mirror showing him his own arrogance. And he could not bear it. Still, the quiet woman did not see it as a battle. She wasn't trying to defeat him or anyone else. Her focus remained where it always had been, on the beauty of the subject itself. To her, mathematics was never about pride or competition. It was about truth, patterns, and the joy of discovery. Whether solving problems in class or in the solitude of her home, she approached it with the same love. The attention of her classmates and the unease of her professor were distractions she did not welcome. Yet she couldn't deny that things had changed. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the whispers that followed her, the way students now hesitated before approaching her with questions. She noticed the professor's sharp looks, his forced calmness, and the way his voice grew harsher during lectures. She sensed that the storm was far from over. The semester continued, and with each class, the unspoken tension deepened. The professor became more relentless in his challenges, and the students became more eager to see how she would respond. What had begun as a simple attempt to embarrass a quiet student had grown into something much larger, a story that the entire class carried, one that none of them would forget. The quiet woman remained steady, not because she wanted to prove herself, but because she knew that silence could hold more power than words, and patience could outlast pride. And though the storm around her grew louder, she walked through it with the same calm grace she had always carried. The semester was nearing its end, and the campus buzzed with the usual mix of excitement and pressure. Students hurried between classes, buried themselves in libraries, and whispered anxiously about final exams. But inside the calculus lecture hall, there was a different kind of tension, one that had built up over months. Everyone knew that the professor and the quiet woman shared a strange and silent rivalry. No matter how many challenges he set, she had met each one with calm confidence, leaving the class both stunned and inspired. The professor, however, was not ready to let go. His pride had been tested again and again, and though he tried to maintain his authority, the students had begun to see him differently. They no longer feared him as they once did. They no longer hung on his every word. Instead, they often glanced at the quiet woman, silently comparing his lectures to her demonstrations. He could feel his influence slipping, and it only deepened his determination to regain control. He decided that the final exam would be his last chance. If he could design it in such a way that even she struggled, he would prove that he remained the true master of the subject. For weeks, he pored over problems, crafting questions so intricate that even seasoned mathematicians might hesitate. He convinced himself that this exam would expose her limits, restoring his reputation in the eyes of his students. The day of the final arrived. Students shuffled nervously into the lecture hall, clutching pencils and water bottles, their faces pale with stress. The professor handed out the thick exam papers, his expression firm but betraying a flicker of anticipation. He glanced toward the back of the room, where she sat as always, calm and steady, her notebook neatly closed beside her. The silence of the exam room was broken only by the sound of pages turning and pencils scratching. Some students groaned softly as they read the first questions, realizing they were far more difficult than anything they had practiced. The professor paced slowly between the rows, watching them struggle, his pride swelling at their discomfort. Yet his eyes kept drifting back to her. She sat upright, her expression composed, reading carefully. Then, as if she had been waiting for this very moment, she picked up her pencil and began to write. Her movements were steady and deliberate, not rushed or frantic. She filled the page with neat calculations, her process unfolding naturally. While others scribbled and erased, her focus remained unbroken, her confidence clear in every line she drew. Minutes turned into hours, and tension thickened. Many students gave up on certain questions, staring blankly at the paper, their hands frozen. But the quiet woman continued, her determination steady, her mind fully engaged with the challenge. To her, this was not a battle against the professor, it was a chance to meet a puzzle that demanded her full attention. She welcomed the difficulty, embracing it like a mountain to be climbed. When time was called, groans filled the room as students handed in their papers. Some looked defeated, others relieved. But when the professor picked up her exam, his eyes narrowed. He saw the pages filled with clear, flawless work. Every step was logical, every solution correct. She had not only answered the questions, she had solved them with elegance, offering methods that showed creativity beyond the ordinary. His heart sank as he realized the truth, she had succeeded again. Days later, when the results were posted, the hallway outside the lecture hall erupted with chatter. Students crowded around the list, pointing at scores and exclaiming in surprise. At the very top, with the highest grade in the entire class, was her name. It was no longer a surprise, but it still left everyone in awe. She had achieved what many thought impossible. The professor, though unwilling to admit it publicly, could no longer deny her brilliance. In class, his tone toward her softened. He stopped trying to embarrass her, stopped setting traps. Instead, he began calling on her with genuine respect, sometimes even asking her to explain concepts to the class. Though his pride still whispered against it, he had learned a lesson that even he couldn't ignore. The students, meanwhile, treated her differently too. She was no longer the invisible figure in the back row. Classmates approached her with questions, not only about calculus but about how she stayed so calm under pressure. They admired her patience, her humility, and her willingness to help without ever making others feel small. Some said she taught them more in a few minutes than they had learned in hours of lecture. Yet despite all the attention, she remained the same. She still walked quietly through the halls, still carried her notebook, still found joy in solving problems alone in the comfort of her room. She didn't seek glory, and she didn't let praise distract her. What mattered most to her was the love of learning itself. That was her true reward. As the semester ended, the story of the quiet woman spread beyond the walls of the classroom. Other students heard about her, professors whispered about her talent, and some even recommended that she pursue advanced studies where her abilities could shine even brighter. She had gone from invisible to unforgettable, not by speaking loudly or demanding attention, but by letting her work speak for her. For the professor, the experience left a lasting mark. He realized, though reluctantly, that arrogance could blind even the most knowledgeable. He had underestimated her because of her silence, mistaking humility for weakness. In trying to humiliate her, he had exposed his own flaws instead. Though he never gave her a full apology, his behavior changed. He began treating all of his students with more patience, less arrogance. Deep down, he knew she had taught him a lesson more valuable than any equation on the board. The classmates, too, carried the lesson with them. They saw that brilliance doesn't always come wrapped in loud voices or bold personalities. Sometimes it hides in the quietest corners, waiting for the right moment to shine. They learned that underestimating others could lead to surprises that change everything. For the quiet woman, nothing felt extraordinary. She didn't see herself as a hero or a genius. She simply loved what she did, and she had stayed true to that love even when the world doubted her. But unknowingly, she had become a symbol of strength for those around her, a reminder that silence can hold power, that humility can outlast pride, and that true talent needs no stage to prove itself. When she walked out of the lecture hall on the last day, the sunlight touched her face as it had on the very first day. Students around her laughed, exchanged stories, and hurried off to their summer plans. She walked quietly among them, her presence calm as always, carrying the same notebook she had carried all semester. She was no longer invisible, but she remained unchanged. She had never needed recognition to know her worth. Her story lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Years later, some of her classmates would still remember the day she stood at the board, chalk in hand, solving problems that silenced even the proudest professor. They would remember how a quiet woman had shown them that true genius is not loud or boastful, it is steady, patient, and undeniable when revealed. And the professor, though he never admitted it openly, carried the lesson with him too. Whenever he faced a new group of students, he thought of her, the woman he had once tried to humiliate, only to discover that she was far greater than his pride. And in that memory, he found humility, the very lesson he had spent his life failing to teach until she arrived.